Thank you everybody for being here. And today I will talk basically on certain interesting types of variations I accidentally run into while doing my research for my PhD thesis. This thesis was done thanks to a stipend I received thanks to the Annalies Maier Award awarded to Jean Winand, who was also my main supervisor during my PhD thesis, which I of course want to thank. Are variation and that are created by scribes in the process of transmission and the creation of coffin texts. But additionally, these are the types of variations that occur mostly when actual human behavior is shown. So therefore, I am unlikely, as I will discuss a bit later, I will not really focus on simple errors that you have crossed out hieroglyphs or the like, but when there's something more going on that is not truly called by the scribe. So this will fall into three main categories. This will be refunctionalization, redaction, and homophony. And first, and I apologize for the people that are completely aware of everything here, I want to quickly go over to generalize what the coffin texts are and a few quirks of their publication, as I think it's always wise to point that out again, even though I'm quite sure that most of you here will absolutely know what I'm talking about. So the coffin texts themselves should be considered part of the decoration pattern of Middle Kingdom coffins, in generally the rectangular coffins, where they're part of the mortuary literature that is being used. The reason I want to specify this mortuary literature is that actually that we separate mortuary text in ancient Egypt from the pyramid text to the coffin text to the Book of the Dead is rather modern, and is unlikely that this was actually understood by ancient Egyptians in exactly the same way. So these coffin texts themselves are generally, and I really have to focus on the word generally here, written on the inside of coffins, but there's enough examples when they're occurring outside of the coffins or on other objects like tombs or papyri or that kind of material, but primarily it's on the inside of coffins. And these are most commonly written in a type of cursive, so they're never truly hieroglyphic. It depends on the location and time what type of script is generally used. So when you're dealing with Derel Bersha, it's commonly what Fisher would call 3B. So that's a cursive script rather close to hieratic. Omer, on the other hand, has in the same general period will use more hieroglyphic looking, but still cursive signs. Once again, this is not a rule, depends really on the coffin and everything, but there you can see certain trends in this regard. So yeah, as I stated already, although we divide for practicality, we divide the mortuary literature in three parts. It is technically the same literature, as there will be spells running from one type to the other that occur in these formats. The coffin texts themselves have been primarily published by the Buck and partially for the pyramid text sections published by Professor Allen. And these occur in coffin text publications, and these are usually a very good go-to when you deal with variation type studies, simply because the Buck was very pleasant in how he presented his data. So he put them synoptically next to each other so that you can rather easily compare the same type of phrase for the same spell in the same format. As you can see here, as a small excerpt from Coffin Text 1, the coffins themselves are referred to by the so-called sigla, and these are always consisting of letter, number, letter codes. In which case, for example, B1P stands for Derel Bersha as the origin of the coffin. The 1 is simply the first one in the sequence, and the P stands for Paris, so that that's the specific coffin is a Derel Bersha coffin from Paris, which is currently in the book. For an actual list of all the sigla and which coffins they are, I would refer you to one of the main publications of Harco Willems, which has a very extensive list of these formats. Based on this list, for my thesis, I have an appendix with the same generally the same information and a few newer publications, because this book comes from 1988. So there have been a few new publications since, but in generally it's a copy of this work, but then specified the coffins I was actually looking at. Well, as stated earlier, I want to discuss mostly variation in coffin text. I use the first variation, the term variation, following Ilona Rigolski, simply because corruption has intrinsically a negative connotation added to it. And variation is more neutral because there are cases where the variation is actually indeed a corruption of the text, but commonly it's simply a change that is not technically worse or better than the other. So therefore the word variation fits a lot better. Note that for the discussion today, I am not intending to dealing with dialectal variations, personal variations of the scribe, or intentional modernizations, which are definitely there and will occur a lot, and there's a lot that can be written about. But today I really want to focus on what I would call more the human aspects to these things. Because in my opinion, all these errors or variations or corruptions that I found in these texts that I will discuss today are actually variations that, in my opinion, I have made. I think most humans have made still, and that is simply a human interaction of how certain things change simply because you misread something when you were copying it, or anything in that regard. And as stated as well, I'm also not really working with errors that were simply caught by the scribe themselves. For example, here is a case for B4LA. So there are two versions of the same spell in this coffin. So therefore, this is A, not B. And as you can see in my my own drawing of the text, because it's rather difficult to get all the permissions, so it's easier simply just to actually hand copy the images in this regard. That there's a red stroke written down here through the road sign. This is because in this coffin, Horus, the god, is always written with this road sign rather than an eagle or something. And it seems that the scribe simply by automated feature wanted to write Iret Her, so the eye of Horus, rather than the actual what's actually the case here. So in this case, the scribe, or at least the scribe or a supervisor, noticed that there was an error and just put a red stroke through it, which is sufficient to point out as an error and that it does not should not be read, even for the deceased dead. And I would not want to go too deeply into metaphysical aspects of the ancient Egyptian mindset of the of death and how these spells work and what happens when there are errors in their copies. So now the first aspect I want to discuss is refunctionalization. Refunctionalization is a case where a variation occurs in the text, which is technically an error, but the scribe noticed that something changed and took some steps to make sure that it's still a functional text. So you will have errors that will simply has the effect that the text can no longer be read. But these cases, the scribe did notice that he might have that something has changed and that he needs to adjust the text to make sure that still makes sense. To give you an example of what I would not call refunctionalization, but how a very minor error can rather extremely change the text, is in spell 225, where the phrase should be Bud F Pu and when I'm F set. So this abomination of his, he does not eat it, because there is no Egyptian who actually would want to eat his abomination. However, in a few versions, the negative N dropped out, which means that it suddenly becomes a positive text. Now, I have to mention here that the phrase I wrote down here is actually not occurring in one of the coffins, because all of them used different subjects or a different verb form, but I reconstructed this in the same format as T1L, simply just to show you what happens. Because in general, what happens still is that the negative N disappeared, and this is not the only time where this happens. And I'm rather certain I remember that this actually happens a few other times with this exact same phrasing. So it's a rather intriguing aspect where something disappears. It's clearly not noticed by the scribe, but it completely switches around what the phrase does mean, which, if you would base any theories of the afterlife on this, is rather important to understand that this might happen. And to be honest, considering that the negative n, which is simply the arms stretched out, is a rather tiny sign, which might even look like a basic line to some, if you look at it quickly in cursive slash hieratic, it is not that surprising that it might drop out when you transcribe the text. So, to go into detail what I would actually call refunctionalization. Here, from spell 75, there's a case here that we're dealing with the god Nun. That is the primary form that occurs in most witnesses, so I would have to assume that that is the, between brackets, correct form of this text. So in both cases, it's ma and we Nanu Gepekui, so Nun saw me when I came to be, because this is from spell 75, which shows that a person always existed and is in a state as Shu. So this whole spell is based on being like Shu, like the air. But therefore, you also already existed before time. And that's what this refers to. However, intriguingly enough, in B1P, this was mistranscribed. And instead of writing Nun, the gods, primeval gods, they actually went to Nut, because it's written rather similar in these scripts. However, yeah, this is simply an error. Just to specify, this is where it exactly occurs in the text, so that you can slightly more easily see it. What is here the case here, and what I assume is the case here, because of course I cannot 100% prove it because I can't ask the person who actually wrote this down, but what I assume is that the scribe misread the text when he wrote it down, in which case the stroke, which happens after the new vase, was misread as a T, because in the type of hieratic script they are using, the T and the stroke can look remarkably alike. And additionally, in certain more cursive scripts, it's also horrendously difficult to differentiate between the A40, so the seated god, and the B1, the seated female. I say this can be the case because this is actually what makes this phrase rather intriguing to me, is the fact that, as I show here below, is that there is actually a clear distinction in B1P between the god and the seated female. So the scribe went out of his way to make sure that the classifier of Nut, in this case, is female. So therefore, this means that although this might have started as an error where a stroke was misread as a T, the scribe was clearly capable enough to notice that, wait, this is female, this is a female goddess, so the classifier should be female rather than the seated man. So therefore, this phrase has been refunctionalized as dealing with a female god rather than a male god. And the meaning of the text changes, theoretically, to some extent, but there is a complete new function. So there is an interaction of the scribe here that happens when based on what is most likely in origin an error. But the fact that this changes in this format, I consider rather interesting. So to a slightly more extreme example, where you actually have a rather drastic lemma shift, occurs in spell 6. So the median phrase for most witnesses here is shesat as chu or shesat as chen. Pronoun will vary based on witness, and which would mean she will make you bright. However, in two witnesses, B4C and MC105, which is the Mentuhotep cemetery in Thebes, so it's Theban coffin. Actually, sorry, not coffin, it's a tomb in this case. Actually changed the phrase to sekep as chen. Now, what happened here, what I think at least, is that as the N8, so the sun with beams coming from it, as you can see already here in the text, they can look rather similar to this loose AA1 and P sign. So if you misread that, yeah, then you can change this rather around. In this case, it's still close enough in comparison to an earlier section in the text where you actually have the AA1 and Q3 sign written out in B6C, there's a lot more distance between it, so there it's really clearly distinct. But what I assume happened indeed is that the switch happened from one to the other simply because the space between the two signs was misinterpreted, that it was not a single sign, but rather two signs. However, what is really important here is that the classifier D45 was added after Segep in these cases. And as this classifier makes absolutely no sense whatsoever with Shesep, it means that this has been added at a later point, but it also means the scribe understood that we're dealing here with a different verb, Segep, which normally would take the walking legs. So the walking legs are an additional feature that has been added to clarify with which verb they are actually dealing. And the fact that this happens in two different regions of Egypt, so one in Berge, one in the Nederhof cemetery, I highly doubt that this is an error that is simply a chronological effect between or the same scribe who did twice in the same faith, or voorlake that got corrupted, or any case. But it's very simple that this is simply an error, but that it has been corrected to make a functional phrase and a functional sign group to represent a lemma. Well, a more difficult one occurs in spell 154, where we're dealing with a slightly rare lemma that is jai-a, so extending the R. In B9C here, I represented, this is how it simply should have been written, and it's rather obvious what it is. However, for some reason, in B1L, the jai-a was changed into jai to cross, to pass over. So what is remarkable here is that suddenly we're dealing with a completely different lemma. However, the important thing here is that the jai lemma to cross is much more common than jai-a, really to a rather extreme extent. So I assume that simply the scribe read the voorlake and misinterpreted the jai-a as so that would mean the cross and the arm as a boat. And to show a bit of an aspect of it, because in this case, I would say that the arm was misread as the water on which the boat lies, and the cross itself was misread as the boat. Now, I have to state that in B1L, the sign looks exactly as I've shown here. So this is absolutely the cursive type of boat that should be read. However, as you can see that the two lines at the sides of the boat have already a bit of a cross feature, that if the voorlake was rather poor, that I'm not completely surprised that the scribe misread this. And additionally, you're dealing with a lemma that's so much more common to them than jai-a. I would not be surprised if an error was made simply because they did not recognize what was actually going on. So now for the second section that I want to discuss is simply all kinds of weird things that occur thanks to the redaction of text. When you transcribe the text from the voorlake, it may be a papyrus, may be ostracon, or whatever was used to transport the text from one place to the other, sometimes adjustments will need to be made. So, for example, especially when dealing with personal text, there are certain coffins that prefer to put everything into the third person by using the name of the owner. Now, this is not a simple case of simply replacing the pronouns in the text, because the Egyptian structure works rather differently in regard to suffix pronouns and when dealing with noun pronouns or nouns in general. So the position of certain sections should change. In which case, and for example, in the case specifically here, that did not went perfectly as it should. And I, for myself, humorously call this find and replace, because this looks remarkably like the function as it happens in Word or any other program where you can find and replace words. And if you don't do that carefully, you will change things in your text that make absolutely no sense. So As stated, this happens usually for personal text. The whole idea about personal text, please look at the publication of Hayes. That explains it a lot better than I could. But in general, personal texts are texts that refer to the owner of the text itself, but are not always written in the first person, thanks to whatever principle is used. So this would be the same as in the pyramid text. You're dealing with the name of the king rather than I, but there are some constructions and some leftover signs that show that certain texts really were originally composed in first person, but have been changed to the third person to fit the requirements of the inscription. Well, the main point where you can clearly see this, especially where the structure is compared, is when you're dealing with the dative construction, where the suffix dative moves in front of the subject, the object, whereas when you're dealing with a noun dative construction, it would move behind the object. As you can see here, in B2BO is what I would call the format how it in the first person should indeed look like. And one of the reasons I chose this is because B2BO and B4BO belong to the generally the same assemblage. So B2BO belongs to duty nacht, the male, and B4BO belongs to the duty nacht, the female. So there were a pair of people that were named the same, but they different gender. But those two coffins are part of a group of 4, technically 6, I believe. But for most of the work in the book, it's going to be the 4, and they belong to the same group. They were found together, so therefore it can be clearly assumed they were made the same around the same time. And if you look at them, they look remarkably similar. So they're not exactly the same, obviously. They will look remarkably similar, and you can see that in the text as well. So it's clear that they were made more or less around the same time. So before BO, as you can see, the dative construction still occurs directly after the verbal construction. This is acceptable in ancient Egyptian, for ancient Egyptian, but not so how it should look. And that's also the reason I added B6C in this case, to show how this should actually look. So the Nanchao should move in front of the subject. So that did not happen. So in this case, although it looks rather minor, it really is the case that the seated man was simply replaced by the name of the owner without taking into regard that you should actually restructure the phrase. However, this also goes rather more problematic because B4BO does this constantly, and this is also one of the reasons I refer to it as find and replace, because it really starts to feel that the scribe simply got the task to replace these signs in texts and just throw and basically just put something from the first person to the third person, and well, these signs usually refer to the first or for the first or second person, so replace that with a name and we're fine. That's how it starts to look, because in these cases, it's still the same that it acts once again, it occurs before the objects, where it should not occur. In this case, it's also B3BO, which is the same owner as B4BO. So this is probably done by the same people or group of people. I have not done any handwriting comparison to see how many hands are actually occurring in these coffins. That's a study that still needs to be done and would still be worthwhile, but it was outside of the type of work I was doing. So once again, B6C shows how it actually should look, whereas B3BO misplaces the name once again, as shown here. Now we're going to a case where this went rather drastically wrong, because it actually ruins the entire phrase, because clearly the verbal form, the second KF, was not clearly understood by the scribe in this case. Because it should read Shetkai as so the verbal stem followed by the morphology addition and then subjects. However, in before BO, it was not only the first person that was replaced. The scribe also decided to replace the V31, 31A, so the baskets, with the name of the owner as well, while still retaining the aleph, bird, so the vulture, in between the two names. So you can see that the structure is theoretically still there, and the scribe simply replaced two signs in the text with a name, but did not went any point beyond there. And really just replaced the text as he found it, which I find a rather intriguing error. And this is actually one of those cases where I have to wonder in how far the people that worked on coffin texts were literate, because you will have examples where you can clearly see that they're absolutely fully literate and completely understand the ancient text. And cases like this, where you would think that somebody who's fully literate would actually catch that something went completely wrong when he wrote it down. So I can't say in how far they were literate. Of course, I would assume that that people that worked on coffin texts in the Middle Kingdom were at least as literate as the work people in Del and Medina. But of course, I can't prove any exact format of this. But there, like I said, this is a case where I start wondering how far they truly were fully literate or not. They were, of course, literate to some extent, but how far I cannot say with certainty. So, in this case, we're dealing with that the scribe should have replaced the first person dependent pronoun we with the name of the owner. But instead of just replacing the entire pronoun, so the quill chick and the seated man, the scribe in B4BO decided to leave the quill chick there, which makes rather limited sense. So still, the scribe really only replaced the seated man sign and did not notice that he should have removed the quill chick as well. And once again, this shows that you can wonder in how far he actually knew, or he or she, or in general, the scribe knew what he was doing, or if he actually understood what he was working on. Or even to some extent, maybe he was fully literate, but was really, he did not care anymore and simply just, I need to change this completely into the third person. Right. Oh yeah, that's usually these signs, so I'm just going to replace anything in this text and who cares. So now, one of the final cases of these ones for BO, I want to refer to one that has multiple first persons in there. And this went once again highly, to some extreme level, rather intriguingly wrong. So in this case, the jet K and the DEC N, the ek in this case, so the second person for this specific spell does not actually refer to the owner of the coffin, but specifically to the butler of Ray, so which is mentioned earlier in the text. But B4BO still simply replaced this second person with the name of the owner as well, which actually in the whole context of the text makes rather little sense. And then added the name again when they were actually dealing with the owner. Then added the name again. And finally, to deal with the first person stative, added the name again. How well, I have to say, I'm currently rather rather surprised that in this case, we don't have to deal with hacker or hacket and then the name of the owner twice, because by now I would actually expect that the scribe would actually have gone that bad that he would actually change the first person state of the GUI or the key. In this case, most likely that he replaced both the signs with the name. So he only did it once. Now, of course, you have to wonder here if the hacket here, is that the T in hacket is simply an error for the R, or if we're dealing indeed here that the scribe did actually change the hacker to the third person feminine stative, in which case the T does actually make sense. Although then the name after it didn't make sense. When I translated myself, I took it as the T as an error for an R, so that it simply became a ZMF rather than a third person stative. But I find it always worthwhile to mention that there are two ways how you can deal with final stative in this phrase. So now another one, and this is one that I know I've done quite a few times when I was younger, is that you skip a phrase when you're transcribing, when you have to write down a text by hand, especially when you're dealing with a new line, or in this case, new column. So in this case, S1C and S2C are both coffins of the same person, the inner outer of the same person. So you can assume that they were made more or less around the same time. And what happened in this case here is that S2C shows the phrase as it more or less should look. Like I said, there's a lot of variation in these spells. So the other versions from other regions will look a bit different, but this one should look the closest. And here you have Wedepu Re, so the butler of Re, after upon my offering tables. However, in S1C, after Wedepu Re have, the scribe, when I start on next column, actually skipped ahead a bit in the text and added the phrase netje her and ra. He added this one here because this is a phrase which occurs slightly later in the spell. So clearly, when he skipped a column, the scribe semi lost his way, recognized the general group, and simply continued from this point onwards, while it was actually slightly ahead. However, very quickly he noticed that there was an error. So he basically, after the second, after the her and ra her, he actually went back to how the phrase normally would look. And yes, when you go to the actual phrase where he jumped ahead, he did actually repeat the same phrase there again as well. So the scribe really know what to do. But simply here, there's simply a section that got added to the phrase because he skipped a line, because there are two sections of the phrase which looked really similar in the text. And I love these types of things when you find them in ancient texts, because it really shows the humanity of the material that we're working with. So another thing that happens in times, this is partly as a way to say space, is that certain text will be written in fully or partial double columns. It means that a single column is actually subdivided into columns again. Usually this is done to actually, when you're dealing with the same structure, verbal structure of a phrase, so that you don't have to repeat all the same signs. So you could consider this simply a lazy aspect of the scribe, or at least a time-saving measure where you can simply doesn't have to repeat all the same signs twice in a row. And in B1P, as you can see here, this is how this looks when it works normally. So there's a hetep and sawaj should be read once, and then the any should be read twice for both verb forms. And the same goes for what follows. And M5C, for example, is the case where the phrase is just correctly written down. However, in T3C, this went rather wrong, because instead of because you can actually understand that if we're dealing in the precursor text, at least, that there the text was actually written down as a double column, because you can see where it goes wrong, because the text is completely nonsensical in its current format, because you get two s's, then followed with watch, then hetep, and then e, and it makes no sense if you want to try to translate it. However, if you consider that this was simply a mistranscription of the precursor, then it makes a lot more sense. This is actually why I added the T3C precursor. Obviously, this is a reconstruction. Of course, I have no hidden access to the precursor text of this specific witness, but this is a reconstruction simply based on the position of the signs, how they occur in sequence. And if you figure out that the scribe simply copied the text left to right in the column itself without understanding the beginning of the coffin, then it suddenly makes sense why the signs occur in that specific sequence. So you would think this is a simple error, can happen. However, this happens more often in the same witness, in the same spell. So clearly this became a structural error of the scribe. So a slightly later phrase simply did exactly the same thing. And once again, I've added what I consider the precursor format, how it should have looked beside it, to show how this should actually work out. And finally, another one that has the same issues again, where there's simply a rather unclear system of how the scribe decide to write everything down, and to make it functionally again, how you should reconstruct double columns in these texts. So this is clearly where the text was transcribed simply incorrectly, and another case where you could wonder that how literate was the scribe, because he clearly understood that normally when you're dealing with two signs next to each other in a column, yes, they follow one another, but in this case there's a little bit more specific function to it, and clearly that did not enter into it, because again, the literacy here is a bit in doubt, because you would think that somebody who actually is fully literate would actually understand that what he is writing down is complete nonsense, or at least notice it to some extent. Well, now we're moving temporarily slightly out of the error section, but rather other systems that are actually used, which are deal with redaction, which I love to see. That I'm not sure, I would assume that most people would have a cursory knowledge of it, but I have spoken to enough people that did not know that words like these exist. I didn't either until I actually started my studies and got to these spells, but there is an Egyptian word for etc. apparently. So hamedra. So this is used, at least for the examples I have for the coffin text, in two specific formats. So one is in the etc. as we would use it to imply additional features that are unwritten. So the example I've shown here is when you're dealing with a phrase that lists a few items next to each other, and you just want to imply that I have covered everything. I've covered all bases, and this is sufficient to work from. And in this case, it's hamedra. But the reason I would consider this simply as just for completion's sake, I added hamedra. Maybe I forgot something, maybe I didn't, because none of the witnesses have any other items of a list following the things that are written down here. So there's nothing beyond dead males, dead females, dead gods, spirits, or anything. There's no other items that are added in any other witness. So clearly this was added for completionist's sake. And this actually does occur more often in the coffin text. So there's one of the main list spells in the coffin text. That's 398, which has a long list of parts of the bout. And this is actually followed the list by the following statement: everything which I have forgotten in this very bout is that which is invoked for me by these gods who are within them. I absolutely love this phrase because it's clearly simply putting out that, yeah, I might not have written everything down in this list that I should have, but hereby this is covered and now there's no issue. So even though the scribe might not have known of the issues, the deceased will definitely know all the parts of the boat, even if they are not written down. And you will see this more often in coffin text in general, especially when you're dealing that simply the side of a coffin ran out of space, that they simply cut off the spell, don't continue it anywhere else. And clearly the occurrence of the spell in these cases is more important than if the spell is there in its entirety. So therefore you will see shortened down versions of the spell quite often as well, simply for what would fit the space or what they were willing to write down. And it seems at least that the existence of the spell on the coffin was more important than how it actually works. Now, the second case is additionally what happens when you're dealing with hamedra is when you really replace sections of text when you're dealing with long constructions. So in spell 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 12, there is a type of phrase that repeats often. Now, I have constructed here the medium phrase of how it should look, more or less, because due to all types of variations, you will never find this phrase in its entirety in any of the spells, or at least not in the spells that are published in the book. So there might be one witness outside the book that I've not seen yet that has this phrase in its entirety, but there's additional variation in there that they separate between those who act male and those who act female, that you can see that on the classifiers and stuff. Some actually write it as a collective, and that all that type of variation occurs. So there's not a unique phrase that actually does it. However, what I found interesting is that there are places where they replace sections of this entire phrase with hamedra. So clearly they did not want to write down the entire section. I would assume it's space or the actual laziness of the scribe, and that hamedra completely sufficed to replace certain sections of the text in their entirety. So as happens in B1P or T1C, and so in B1P it actually replaces a different section than occurs in T1C, for example. This is relatively rare, and what I do need to make very clear is that hamedra here specifically functions as a repeating of a phrase that occurs somewhere in the coffin. So If the phrase did not occur earlier in the coffin itself, the Hamid Ra is not used. So it cannot replace something that has not been written somewhere. And additionally, Hamid Ra does not replace repeat or anything, something that's early in text. So therefore, it is rather distinct from Sepsenu, which always directly duplicates what is in front of it, or very close in front of it at least. And Hamid Ra can follow columns and columns later in the same text. So that's rather interesting how it's used. I have not seen it that much outside it yet, and for my own article, I had to refer to literature from the 1900s, so there's not that much has been written about it since then. I think it was Peel, but I have to verify my sources to check if that's exactly where it is. But yeah, that one is still, to my knowledge, still the most up-to-date discussion of Hamid Ra, and I don't want to assume here that I'm saying anything new here, but rather just show you how this works in practice. Now, I want to go to the final sections, is homophony. Homophony. I really need to work on my pronunciation here. And this was actually one of those features that I found really interesting when I started to spot them. So the first one is directly also one of my favorite examples of this entire set, where you're dealing here with the final lemma of the text. And in my opinion, you can only explain the variation that occurs here. So between Genny to play music, as occurs in B3 BO, and Gennet in before C, or Gennet seen in before BO. So one is, to save us from pronunciation issue, one is written with H3 and the other one is written with H4. And as the signs in the script are so different, I don't think it's possible that this variation occurred due to simply visual corruption of how these groups would look in even in cursive script, even in poor cursive script or rhetoric. So to me, this shows that at least in certain sections of the transmission from the text to the coffins themselves, that there was a verbal aspect. Because if you assume it's, especially when you're dealing with late material, you would know that the H3 and H4 are completely interchangeable. And this would work as rather decent proof that this is apparently already the case in the Middle Egyptian, that even for native speakers, that the difference between the two H's here is not as clear anymore, and that you have to work from context to figure out what you're dealing with than anything else. And clearly, the context here is not clear enough what you're dealing with. The final example of this list, this one actually has Gennet with the bird lifting off. You can explain this one in two ways. So if you really want to push my argument to say, yeah, but this is the other type of Kenny where it means to alight, so to fly up. But if you compare it to other cases of the same text, this can also be used for music and dancing without issue in ancient Egyptian as well. So that's actually where I'm personally at, because I don't want to charge any arguments that I can make here, because I prefer to stay on the safe side. So although I added an example here just to show that the difference between two can be rather difficult to figure out, and especially because of the seated man behind it with hand to mouth, makes it likely that this is something to do with making music rather than alighting. But I did want to show it here just to make sure that I cover my base and show that even within true homophones, so the ones that we should be rather certain that they probably sound a bit rather alike, that even there you have potential issues. And it really depends on the scribe what he thought he heard and wrote that, and based on that decided on the type of classifiers that were added. And yeah, so in certain cases it's rather clear, but here I really love the fact that you can see this change, and it really, to me at least, shows there was at least at some points there were verbal interactions that decided how the transmissions worked, rather than actual purely working from written down text that you can just hold above your work and write it down, which closely resembles how quite a few of the scribal works actually occurred. So it's not that surprising to me at least. The next one I'm dealing with here is a case where you're dealing with, as least as is written down, with two lemmas, and one usually transcribed as imi, the other usually as me, where you're dealing with two imperatives, but both from rather distinct lemmas. But the fact that I can be rather interchanged here based on the classifiers that have been added, so I have to assume here that the scribe had to make an interpretation of which imperative they were dealing with, that they had to make a choice. And it makes a rather drastic change to how you would interpret the phrase. But it also shows, because once again, in actual writing, rarely are the actual phonetic complements of the yots added at all. It shows that you can't say with certainty which of the two you're dealing with. So the imi would be an interpretation simply on the hands following the al, and the me from e to come is that based on the walking legs. But it seems to me, at least, that these two imperatives probably sounded a lot alike, that the scribe could not be certain which of the two they were actually working with here. So they had to make a choice. And once again, I added two examples here, so B1BO and G1T, simply show that this is not simply one error occurring in one region or anything at all. And to add here as well that B1BO and B2BO belong to a pair. So here we might, in theory, actually be dealing not with unconscious variation, but actually with conscious variation. Because we're dealing with an inner and outer coffin, it might be that actually the scribe intentionally varied the forms here. I've seen more cases of this. So you have usually it's basically that the inner coffin is truly in the first person and the outer coffin is in the third. Or but I have seen more cases where you really get the feeling that the different witnesses were treated and given a slightly different variation. And I'm rather certain that it's probably more intentional than a random variation, especially when you're dealing with pairs of coffins. So once again, I can't be 100% of this because it requires a lot more study, in my opinion, but I think it is always worthwhile to keep at least a note of it, because I would consider this a rather interesting feature. So the next one is actually where we start to get an intriguing case where you once again deal with at least what for us would be absolutely homophone, where you deal with sechti versus sechet to trap. These cases are obviously what we're dealing here with is sechti hetep, so the fields of offerings. There's no doubt that that's what they were intending to write here, as one can see in T1C. But in B6C, yeah, they wrote it as if it was the verb to trap, but it's still clearly sechti hetepu. So in this case, I think this is more a joke of the scribe, especially because this does not happen anywhere else with this, for either to trap or for field. So this looks to me rather intentional. However, when you go to BH5C, this becomes a bit more problematic, because on one hand, you could simply still state we're still dealing here with the joke, but the scribe decided to write it both ways. So once as a trap, once as a field, but it's still the dual fields. So that would be the easier way to understand this. However, if you want to be rather extreme about it, which I at times do as well, is I actually did translate it as two separate entities. And then you get a rather weird aspect and rather weird translation. I'm not saying that this translation that I made, the second one, is remotely correct at all. I'm rather certain it simply should read sechti hetepu. But I find it worthwhile that you could wonder into which extent the person working on the coffin originally got this as the pun form, but still did not really understand that this is actually simply a pun and had to work it out somehow, because he felt that it was incorrect to have sechti with traps hetepu. So I had to add the actual field in there, but still kept the sechet because it might have been viable. So it's rather difficult to say exactly what the underlying reasoning is here, of course, but I find it interesting nonetheless. So here, this is going to take slightly more explanation, but most explanation is done in Prushkin's publication of these spells. So we're dealing with 154 to 158. The Book of the Moon for Prushkin will go much more detail of the pun of Senut here. So Senut in this spell and in this exact location should read flagpoles. But they especially play around with this because in the phrase after it, they are actually talking about the Senut festival, which is clearly for the Egyptian already a homophone, so they can play around with it. And therefore this overlaps. But considering that we're dealing with the verb sa'aha, I am rather certain that flagpoles would be the correct thing to interpret here. However, this went rather but slightly wrong in the other witnesses that have the same spell. And they clearly got confused by the Senut festival in question. So in S2C, it is actually written as the Senut festival. And I can't say if it's useful to actually to erect a Senut festival. Maybe it's possible in ancient Egypt that you can erect the festival, but I rather think that here the scribe really got confused by the pun, actually. That this is a pun where it's simply wrong. But once again, the only variation you can really see is in the classifier. But you would really want to have the sticks or something like that in here. B for LA actually went for Senut, a shrine, thanks to the O1 classifier which occurs here. So here we are dealing that once again you have another homophone of Senut, which in this case would actually mean shrine, but it moved quite far away from the actual idea of flagpoles. Now, in the last example I've added here as well is that this happens also quite a few examples where you're dealing with Senut really only written as the three arrows, no classifiers whatsoever, so you can't really say what they want to read, but based on observations done at least for that I saw in Karnak, thanks to the Karnak database from Montpellier, this can be a normal writing for flagpoles. This is not an issue, at least in the New Kingdom, and I would assume that this is not an issue in the Middle Kingdom either. So you have, but if you want to, you can read this one as brothers as well. So this is really the case that because there are no classifiers, you can't know for certain what you should read here, but there are quite a few options here. So as you can see here, thanks to homophony, there's quite a lot of options that suddenly occur, but clearly there are changes and variations that occur on same science groups that sound at least the same. And although some might be intentional variations because the scribe just like to do it, in certain cases you start to wonder in how far the scribe really still understood the text. But it is rather clear that the scribe has to have heard it rather than just read it, or at least at some point. So I'm not saying that we're dealing here with somebody lecturing, somebody working over a coffin, but it could also have happened when the voorlage was created on an earlier stage. So I do need to make that clear that you can't know for certain when the variations sneak in. Sometimes you can suggest something, but in most cases it's really, yes, a variation occurred. That's absolutely true, but when it happens, I can't say whatsoever. So another one is we're dealing with spell 335, which is for a large section constructed by having little vignettes stated of a question followed by an answer. And in this case, we have the variant M1NE, which is SIPU, which is simply a compound interrogative. But apparently in M4C, this was read rather incorrectly because they changed the question, or at least visually, they changed the interrogative because it might be that scribe still interpret this simply as an interrogative rather than the noun construction I took it as. They changed it into the man, rather, so C, man. And why I want to point this out, because it happens a few more times when you're dealing with SIPU in this format, and it only occurs in M4C, so this is a structural error of the scribe, in my opinion, or at least a structural variation that happens. So that happens in most cases when you're dealing with SIPU, because there is also the other interrogatives occur as well, so there's a bit of an option. But what I find rather interesting here is that does actually show that, at least for Mer in the early 12th dynasty, that the word for man was pronounced to some extent with a vowel. I'm not one to go into what vowel it was or anything like that, because I really don't have the evidence for that. But it does show that it was indeed understood as a lemma that included a vowel after the radical S. Because otherwise the change from sipu to espu would make very little sense in my book. Or it meant, of course, that the interrogative lost the vowel clearly in its pronunciation, but I would assume it's the other way around. That's simply that although we can't really see the vowel in man, it was probably at that time still clearly pronounced, or clearly enough to pronounce that you can create this type of variation. Now, I want to go into a few cases where you could argue that it's simple homophones from each other, but I would actually think it's slightly different. And this type of issue has been coined alternative classification by Gülden Chantrin, currently working in Liège. And when she told me about this, the article is still under review. I hope it has been accepted by now. I assume so, to be honest. So. But at least for more detail, the article should be upcoming, and otherwise you have to ask Chantrin directly about what she exactly means with it. But basically what it means is that the classification of a lemma can vary and actually creates different shades of meaning purely on the different lemmas, on the different classifier used, while phonetically the word stays the same. So the first example I have here is from 1230, where you're dealing with the word ich. So this is usually translated as shout or as pain. And B1L is the variant that I would personally translate as pain, because you're dealing with the bad word G37. So this is the case where it's something negative. But no clarification with this, so I think meaning pain is not out of order. And if I accuse other witnesses, so in this case the before variant is the one that actually has a seated man behind it, which imply some sort of human act. So in this case, most likely an exclamation, so therefore shout. This at least is understood. But then you have to wonder, are we dealing with two lemmas here? So one specifically for pain, one specifically for shout, or are we actually dealing with the alternative classification issue? And I would actually argue for alternative classification here, that the lemma I in general means something in regard to pain. But depending on the classifier actually used in the text, that it will actually be the idea of pain or shout, rather specifically an exclamation of pain. So, well, stub your toe, and you know what I mean with that. So therefore, it is actually the same lemma, but the color of the interpretation should change based on the classifiers used. And this is actually not the only case where this happens. So in spell symphony 5, we have the same issue here, that we're dealing with the guardians of the limbs of Osiris, or the guardians of the rooms of Osiris. Depending on the classifier, you can interpret this both in two ways. So it's the lemma is at, and in B3C, we're dealing with a house sign. So this should be a place, location, or something like that. So this is one of the reasons why this is usually translated as rooms. And in the other versions, as I've shown here, we're dealing with the flesh sign, which is following it, which means it is a body part in this regard. So it's translated as limbs. However, once again, I think we're dealing here with the classification issue, and that the lemma at on itself should actually be understood simply as part of. So a room is a part of a house, and a limb is a part of a body, or at least something in that regard. So that the lemma itself is rather vague, but that the classification can really specify what we are exactly, what type of part of we're actually dealing with. But yeah, this would sound the same, so you can't really say with certainty if you listen to it, which part is meant and what actually fits best the structure of the phrase. So that's the whole problem with this alternative classification, is that there is some overlap of what you can call homophony, and some case where you really wonder if this is actually two different lemmas or not. Once again, in this case, I would argue it's actually one lemma, but with different shades of meaning based on the classifier used. However, how this would affect verbal speech, I really can't say, because this would be a written aspect to it. And if this is actually the case in ancient Egyptian spoken text, you can really wonder how difficult it would be to change around. But on the other hand, in English, you can make this as difficult as well. If I asked to quote the Simpsons here, I don't know whether the weather will improve. So if I ask you to spell weather, but not specify which of the two I meant, I wish you good luck. And I can always say that you should have written the other, spoken the other one. So even in our modern spoken language, you have these rather homophonic sound words, and that can be spelled distinctively and mean rather different things. But like I said, this is simply an example of how this would theoretically work. Now, for the final example here, where it once again looks more like a homophony case, so that there's homophones here, is when you're dealing with Winand, so the right hand, and it's rather obvious that we're dealing here with the right hand of Atum. So, of Reatum, exactly. Note by the way that these texts are really heavily damaged, and that certain sections will be technically reconstructions, but based on the classifiers, you can assume what was there. So what happened here is that normal writing for Imani or Wenami right hand is changed in Wenem to eat. And this looks rather weird, and it looks rather close. This is indeed a homophonic issue. However, if you go to Muller's publication from 2012, he has a reasonable alternative suggestion to this one. And I think he is correct here in this guys. So this is not homophony, but this is actually a playful writing that implies the actual state of how this would work. As people that might be aware from India as well, is there's a hand for eating and there's a hand for doing other things, usually including excrement. And you should not differentiate these two. So you should not let these two overlap. Now, what Muller suggests here is that when I'm here, it's very simply a playful writing as right hand as the hand that is used for eating. And that is really simply a playful way to show that we're dealing with the right hand, or literally in these cases, the eating hand of the person in question. So therefore here, it's likely that the when I'm here is more a play on the whole idea of the right hand, that is the hand used for eating, rather than actually specifically dealing with a case of different lemmas, and that there's an error here that the scribe did not understood. We're dealing here with a right hand rather than eating. So here I am, luckily for you all, gonna call it to the end. This was one of the last examples that I wanted to show. In my article, I have a few more, but not that many. But at least I hope I have been able to show you a few cases here of interesting variation that occurs in the coffin text. And that it's actually rather valuable at times to study all these types of texts in a synoptic form, and so that you can easily compare them to each other, because it will show different things that occur behind the text. And I hope I can I would have shown here that yes, the Egyptians were human, and yes, they make errors that we still make 5,000 years later at times. And that I personally just love the idea that we really haven't changed that much. I really would like to thank you for your attention, and I would love to hear any remarks or questions or anything at all, if that is needed. Thank you so much for